Hello and welcome everyone. Depending upon where you are, it might be evening, afternoon, or morning. My name is Adis Judaria, and I will be one of your hosts for today's event. Um, I would like to apologize on behalf of the organizers regarding the Singaporean time frame that was given in the poster. There was a slight misunderstanding regarding the time zone difference. Um, I'm talking to you in my capacity as one of the co-founders of the Network of Spiritual Progressives Australia, who is one of the hosts and organizers of this series of interfaith events that are going to take place throughout this year. I would like to thank and acknowledge all the efforts and work that has been done by our co-hosts, the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore in particular. I would like to thank Imran, who has done a lot of behind the scenes work in making this event happen. Before we go into the actual proceedings of the event, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the objectives and the history behind the thinking or the background behind this series of interfaith events. I would like to first of all start by saying that, as I already mentioned, I am here in my capacity as a co-founder of the Network of Spiritual Progressives Australia that was founded back in 2017. We are a chapter of our parent network that is based in the United States. We are essentially a loose network of individuals from various faith traditions, primarily based in Brisbane, who have been active in the interfaith space for a very long time. One of the ideas that we had a couple of years ago was to actually introduce a little bit more theory into what transpires usually during an interfaith event. Um, for those of us who have been part of the interfaith scene, we often have been involved in a number of um, discussions, trying to learn from other religious traditions, trying to share our own perspectives and points of view, but perhaps there has been less focus on thinking deeply about this idea of under what conditions would a fruitful interfaith dialogue take place. Yeah. So, um, so the main objective behind this series of interfaith conversations is to uh, delve more deeply and try to gain a better understanding and answer this question of how can we engage in fruitful interface dialogue that's going to result in mutual enrichment of all those who are taking part in this dialogue. Now, in order to aid us in all of this, we have selected theoretical framework developed by one of the leading scholars, academics and scholars in this area, Professor Catherine Cornell, who teaches at Boston College, who is one of the leading scholars in the area of interfaith dialogue theory. So the way this series is basically set out, it is going to closely follow the 5 conditions that Professor Cornell has set out and discussed in terms of what these constructive conditions for interfaith dialogue might be. Our today's event is an introductory event, and it is going to essentially, as per the poster, it is going to involve 4 individuals, 2 of them based in Brisbane, myself and Mr. Ari Heba, and 2 individuals from Singapore, Muhammad Imran and Ms. Guat. And all of us have been involved in interfaith dialogue in one way or another for a very long time. We are going to talk about several issues pertaining to the objectives and the rationale behind this interfaith series. So I would like to now, without any further ado, move on to the next item and introduce Ms. Guat, who comes to us from Singapore and who is a Catholic, but currently she's a chairperson of one of the co-sponsors and co-hosts of this interfaith series, Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore. She holds a Master's of Arts in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations from Hartford Seminary, Connecticut. So she's academically very capable. And she has also worked not only on interfaith issues at an academic level, she also has a long-standing interest and participation in interfaith issues at the grassroots level, including organizing and running a 6-weekend program, developing conversation series, building capacity for interreligious dialogue and engagement at the Harmony Center, which is an interfaith institution under the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore that ran over 2 years from 2008 and 2009. And she has also written a book titled History of Christian-Muslim Relations in Singapore from Independence to Post-9/11 that was published in 2019. She also received a Sally J. Terry Award for academic and interfaith work in the community back in 2008. Thank you very much, Guat, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adis. Good afternoon, everyone from Singapore. It's a pleasure to be with you today. On behalf of the Center for Interfaith Understanding, we are pleased to be a partner with the Australian chapter of the Network of Spiritual Progressives in this online interfaith series. Before I begin to talk about interfaith relations, I would like to talk a little bit about Singapore, because the context of Singapore is very important and related to interfaith relations. As you may know, our land area is very small. We're only 728 kilometers square, and our population at 2020 was like about 5.69 million. And majority of the people, like 76%, are Chinese. The rest are Malay, which is 15%, ethnic Indians, 7.4%, and the rest would be Eurasians and others, people from other ethnic groups. Most of us, and like 81% of us, actually live in public housing. So we are a very dense country, all right, short on land, and we live in high-rise flats mainly. And the number of religions that we have in Singapore, official religions under, would include Buddhism, which form about 33.2% of the population, Christianity, 18.8%, which is like Catholics and Protestant Christians and other Christian denominations. Islam would be about 14%, Taoism and folk religions, 10%, Hinduism, 5%, Zoroastrian, Judaism, Baha'i, Jainism in smaller percentage, and we have the spiritual but not religious, or people who are atheists and humanists, and they form about 18.5%. So we are actually very, very diverse in our form, as well as in our race, because officially under our race, we would have we would have Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others as well. And so this is a very complex mix of people, as well as we have a large population of transient population who live in the community as well. So let me go back a bit about why interfaith is important in my country. And it actually started especially so in 1942, when the world changed for Singapore and it fell under the Japanese onslaught and came under Japanese occupation. The people suffered tremendous hardship. All right, but one thing was clear was the Japanese actually regarded the Chinese as enemies, only less dangerous than the British. And specifically, they targeted the Chinese, whereas they supported the Malay community. All right. And so these efforts by someone who comes to your country and takes over it actually causes divides among the people. All right. And there was a lot of violence that happened to the Chinese, and there were massacres and things like that. And these things that happen in history actually do affect and come down through the generations. All right. And so later on in 1950, we had the Maria Hertog riots, which was placed as like a Christian-Muslim riot, in the sense that because they were fighting over a child that had been adopted by a Muslim mother, but she was actually Dutch in heritage. And it became a complex issue of who gets the child, was the child adopted? And that caused, during the court case, a lot of negative emotions coming out, and between the Muslims, and, you know, that they felt that they were under siege, and the Muslims are mainly Malays in our country. And it caused riots, and people died during that. So our heritage has been quite a violent and up and down in the relationships, especially, you know, during our independence, all right, when we became independent from the British. I remember that in the 1965, when I went to primary school, my mom said, I'm going to put you to a school closest to your auntie, because if in case we have a riot, you can run home to her. So you can imagine what it was like in those early days. And of course, increasingly, we learned how to live and work together. But most of us have some form of religion or spirituality, and we live face to face with each other, and there are bound to be conflicts, differences about uses of places and spaces and sounds and prayers. And it is very natural for us to only think of our religion as the best. But in Singapore, that's very difficult because the land area is very small. Your neighbor is just next door. And what he does may, by sound, by prayers, by offerings, may affect you. And so there was a deliberate attempt to actually build relationships with people of different faiths. And I want to say that that happened with the founding of the Interreligious Organization in 1949. And the founding was actually mooted by a man called Maulana Muhammad Abdul Alim Siddiq. All right, and he was a roving ambassador of peace. And he felt that the only thing that we can do to let the followers of each and every religion know the religions of other religions is that a spirit of fellowship be created among them, so that they can all work together to spread the accepted morals and to fight the common evils. And at the same time, the Methodist Bishop, Reverend Hobart Armstead, said that positive peace could only come when men could find ways to unite themselves, when men learn to stress not points of difficulty, but points of agreement, and to recognize the possible levels of relationship on which men live together. So this has been our sort of heritage from independence on, that there is a place for interfaith engagement. In the early stages, it fell a lot onto our leaders, and the formation of the organization, Interreligious Organization, which represents basically the 10 major religions in Singapore. But as you know, within a religion, there's also diversity. All right, and there are also differences. So now it's not just only major religions and minor religions, but there's also differences between each religion in the different communities. Some communities are accepted, some communities are not accepted. And so as we come on to this period in the 21st year, we find that with the COVID and the pandemic, that there are also stresses in our fabric in society. And especially after 9/11 happened, that the tensions in a sense became worse because we are looking at particular groups of people. We think that they may be terrorists. But recently, just over the last 6 weeks, we've had a Christian who wishes to harm Muslims in a mosque. He's a young man. And we've also had a Singaporean youth who was planning a knife attack on Jews. So increasingly, we find that it is very critical for not only the government who involved in interreligious dialogue, but also for the grassroots. And the government has been doing a wonderful job. We've got the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, all right, for people who speak negatively about religions or cause divisions and hatred and violence against each other. At the same time, we have a lot of grassroots communities like the interreligious and racial confidence circles. We have the ministries and different small groups that have arisen. And one of them is actually the Center for Interfaith Understanding. We became shall we say, a society last year, and with the objectives of promoting an inclusive space for critical engagement that bridge theory and practice on interfaith issues in Singapore. Our founding director is Muhammad Imran, who you'll meet in a short while. And within a year, SIFU actually established local and international interfaith partnerships that benefit the Singaporean community throughout through its programs. In September, as we became a society and was registered as a non-government organization under the Register of Societies in Singapore, the founding members included interfaith advocates identified as Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Baha'i, Buddhist, and humanists, amongst others. And our advisor is Professor Yaacob Ibrahim. We look to an exciting future for interfaith work in Singapore and to collaborate, to contribute to the global discourse on pluralist societies, such as this particular occasion. We'd just like to highlight one or two things that we have been involved in, which is the Global Interfaith Leadership Series, for instance, is an annual program that we have a person of scholars of international repute in the field of interfaith studies and interfaith work give a keynote lecture. Our first inaugural lecture was by Professor Francis Clooney, Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. Our second speaker was Professor John Tatamaniel on his book, Interreligious Learning in a Polarized World, Circling the Elephant. And we recently commemorated the International Women's Day program with Women and Patriarchy in Religions. We believe that there is a need to create safe spaces for conversations, and we have been involved in the community level with youth and will continue to create opportunities for interrelationships to build, to challenge our assumptions, and to build community with each other. Thank you. I would also now like to introduce our next speaker, and it's Mr. Ari Heber. He is the current president of Queensland Jewish Community Services, a member of the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group, and deputy chair of the Police Ethic Advisory Group. He serves on the boards and is advisor to several Jewish welfare and religious organizations, and the original Who Is My God series. Mr. Ari was for many years the chair of the Queensland Jewish Interfaith and Jewish chair of the Queensland Forum of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. He has been the Jewish chaplain at the University of Queensland and was active with the Centre for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Multi-Faith Centre, Griffith University. He is currently still active with the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group, which is supported by Venerable Master Chim Kung. I'd like now to introduce Ari.
Thank you very much for that, Yat. I'm speaking about the original series that we did back in 2012. One of the problems with interfaith is that organizations can't establish relations between them. It has to be between people. So in 2012, Who is My God was co-founded by myself from Queensland Jewish Community Services and Margaret Nayland from the Roman Catholic Commission for Ecumenism and Interreligious Relations, and with Dr. Brian Adams of the Centre for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue. The first Who is My God was run at the Multi-Faith Centre at Griffith University as part of the United Nations Interfaith Harmony Week in 2012. It was such a successfully received program that there were 4 other events that year. And when we finished the first year, the popularity, it proved so popular that it expanded to include rites and rituals, holy spaces, life cycle events, and it actually ran for 4 years. The popularity of the events was due to the social fellowship after the program, where members of the different faith traditions were able to mix and chat. These relationships proved to be the foundation of many lasting interfaith relationships and the establishment of several interfaith groups. We'd been planning to re-establish the series in 2020, but COVID delayed it. Given that most of it was supposed to be, people in the room sharing, talking, COVID Zoom meetings weren't appropriate to do it. So we're looking to run the original format later in 2021 or maybe even 2022, depending on how we go. And we're looking at running it in several cities in Southeast Queensland, Toowoomba, Brisbane, Gold Coast, and the Sunshine Coast. At the closing of the Centre for Interfaith and Cultural Dialogue at Griffith University earlier this year, it was acknowledged as one of the most successful programs in the Centre's history. Its format was very simple. You would have 2 or 3 speakers from different faith traditions speaking for 20 minutes each, followed by a moderated Q&A session, which would go for 20, 30, 40 minutes, depending on the interests. And then the important part of the networking was the networking over beverages and light snacks provided by the speaker's faith tradition. Some faith traditions that don't have dietary laws found it difficult to comprehend other dietary laws, but the standard we had was vegetarian, no cheese, bring anything you like. And the program would run for approximately 2 hours. It was done every 3 or 4 months, and I felt it was successful. So that's the sharing I have for the original Who is My God. So I would now like to reintroduce Dr. Adas, a senior lecturer and researcher at Griffith University, Australia. He lectures and researches on issues pertaining to contemporary Islam with specific reference to spiritual hermeneutics, Islamic fundamentalism, gender, and interfaith dialogue. He's also an activist-minded scholar who is one of the leading theoreticians in the academic theory of progressive Islam and Islam-West relations. His publications include The Sunnah and its status in Islamic law, published in 2015, and The Imperatives of Progressive Islam, 2017, and Islam and Gender, Major Issues and Debates, co-written in 2020. Dr. Adas, to you.
Thank you so very much, Ari, for that generous introduction. Essentially, what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so is to provide a entry point, a brief skeleton summary of Professor Kathleen Cornill's constructive conditions for interfaith dialogue. As you might recall, when I did my introduction earlier on, I said that one of the issues that has been identified as perhaps not having received a lot of attention in interfaith circles among interfaith practitioners is this issue of what conditions or which factors could be identified as important in bringing about fruitful and constructive interfaith dialogue. I know that some practitioners and people who have been active in this interfaith circles at times have lost faith, perhaps in the efficacy and importance of interfaith dialogue, because they felt that there was not much constructive, there were not very many constructive ideas that were being kind of bounced around and discussed, and it wasn't always clear in which direction this dialogue should go, how should it be structured, and to just bring a little bit more theoretical and academic rigor in these discussions. So, because one element of what I do as an academic deals with the religious pluralism element, and how does the Islamic interpretative and intellectual tradition deal with the religious pluralism element. I have been fortunate enough to have come across Professor Catherine Cornell's important theoretical work on this, specifically on this issue of which conditions are necessary for people who are engaging in interfaith dialogue, in order for those concerned, in order for them to actually make the most out of it, if you like. How can we maximize the time spent in dialoguing with each other, and what kind of, let's say, not presuppositions, but what kind of attitudes perhaps are important in order to really make this dialogue as productive and as constructive as it can be. So with that in mind, I would like to now provide, as I said, a very basic surface level discussion of these 5 conditions or elements that have been identified and discussed very elegantly and with a lot of depth and insight by Professor Catherine Cornell. And as you might recall, those of you who have seen the poster, the subsequent events that we are organizing are zooming in each one of these specific conditions, zooming in on one of these specific conditions, and our speakers are going to discuss at length that a particular condition and bring in their expertise as well as personal experiences to bear upon that particular condition. All right, so I've already spoken to this slide, and therefore I don't need to speak to it much further, apart from saying that in my considered view, Professor Cornell's theoretical framework is one of the best out there that gives us structure and food for thought in terms of how to go about practicing interfaith dialogue in the best possible manner. So what are these 5 factors that constitute constructive conditions for interfaith dialogue as per Professor Catherine Cornell's theoretical framework? Well, I have, as you can see in this slide, the first one is referred to as epistemological humility. The second one has to do with commitment to a particular religious tradition. The third one centers on the idea of interconnection. The fourth one is all about empathy, being, bringing in an empathetic understanding with you into the actual dialogue. And finally, this idea of hospitality to truth. So what I'll do is I'm going to provide a very brief set of insights into each one of these conditions, as just to prepare the stage for the subsequent series and sessions that we are going to have. These insights are by no means exhaustive, and I essentially just briefly highlight some of the key words, key considerations as they pertain to each one of these conditions. Okay, so let's look at the first one, epistemological humility. All right, I know it's a scary word, but essentially what it means is that when we engage in interfaith dialogue, or for that matter, when we engage in any kind of dialogue, we need to bring a set of attitudes and even presuppositions that cannot be premised upon the idea that you know, I know everything, I have a full understanding of not on my own tradition, but the tradition of the religious other. That is definitely not going to help in bringing about constructive interfaith dialogue. What epistemological humility is all about is basically recognizing that we have a number of limitations as individuals that pertain to how much knowledge and insight we have, not only of our own tradition, but that of the religious traditions of others. And therefore, by acknowledging that, we accept and recognize the idea that it is possible to grow and change and develop further insights into that of our understanding of the religious tradition of the other, and perhaps as a result of that, also potentially grow and change within our understanding of our own religious tradition. In other words, epistemological humility implies or asks or demands of us to recognize that while we cling to our own particular truth, we need to acknowledge that we come from a particular perspective, from a particular point of entry, that is, and that this, this idea of bringing our own perspective into this dialogue is inevitable. It also, this idea of epistemological humility manifests itself in this idea, in the acceptance of the idea that no no individual who takes part in interfaith dialogue can claim to have a non-absolute and non-relativistic understanding of truth, or their understanding of truth. So this idea that truth is not complete does not necessarily mean that there is no truth as such, but that this idea of truth being there can be arrived at some future point in time, or perhaps it can manifest itself in the belief that each and every truth is relativistic. It's based upon certain cultural and historical contingencies that are inevitable and part of each individual's makeup. Moving on to the next element, and that second element that Professor Catherine Cornell has identified is this idea of commitment, or the idea of being a representative or speaking on behalf of not just not bringing in just your own individual subjectivities and understanding of the religious tradition, but being able to and willing to be a representative of the broader tradition, cumulative tradition that you are a part of. Otherwise, if there is no element of commitment on behalf of a person who engages in interfaith dialogue, then it would be legitimate to ask to what extent does this individual actually represent the religious tradition in any meaningful sense. So being committed and being rooted in a particular tradition is very important, even if that rootedness allows for the person who is taking part in this dialogue, it allows that person to be open-minded and open to new insights and new understandings. And of course, there are a number of tensions that could exist between an individual's understanding of their own tradition and that of the broader cumulative inherited tradition. But therefore, it is very important for the individual to be committed and to acknowledge the broader cumulative tradition, and even if that particular person disagrees with certain interpretations or certain approaches to that cumulative tradition. So it cannot be just a purely idiosyncratic, subjective approach. It needs to take the religious tradition that one belongs to seriously into consideration. The third element has to do with this idea of interconnectedness. So this basically entails that at some level or the other, people who are engaged in interfaith dialogue do need to be able to relate to the religious tradition of the other, and they do need to have some kind of basic agreement as to what the focus of or the study of that of what is being discussed. If there is no common ground whatsoever, and there is no commonly identified object of study, then that would impede any kind of effective interfaith dialogue. That doesn't mean, this sense of interconnectedness does not imply that every religious tradition has the same understanding of what God means or whether or not what God connotes. But so even if the concept of interconnectedness is conceptualized differently, the very basic consideration here is that all the partners in interreligious interfaith dialogue do need to acknowledge that at the most very basic level, there is a common focus of study that all of the different partners can, in one way or another, be seen to be kind of connected to. Yeah, and you can see I have provided you a quote from one of Professor Cornell's publications in terms of as to what this exactly means. So the fourth condition that Professor Cornell has identified in terms of what's necessary in order for those who are for people who are interested in participating in constructive interfaith dialogue is the condition of empathy. I'm sure this is not a surprise to anyone, because empathy is something that we need to have in order to have any kind of meaningful and productive relationship, not just in the context of of interfaith dialogue. How does Professor Cornell use or define empathy in the context of interfaith relations? So basically, she talks about it in terms of this willingness of the religious self to kind of extend and stretch one's religious imagination beyond what we are familiar with within our own tradition, and be willing to immerse ourselves into the religious of the other, in order to gain a better understanding of that religious tradition. And I think one of the best role models in this respect that I think really demonstrates this attitude and approach to the religious other is one of the most renowned scholars of world religions who passed away a few years ago, Huston Smith. To demonstrate what I mean by that, for example, Huston Smith immersed himself for 10 years in 3 different religious traditions: Sufism, which is the spiritual kind of a mystical orientation within the Islamic tradition. He immersed himself in the religious practices of Sufism, Hinduism, and, if I'm not mistaken, the Jewish faith, but I could be wrong, while at the same time still holding on to his Christian religious convictions. So empathy is about immersing. Of course, there are different degrees to which one would or is willing to immerse oneself. Huston Smith is probably more radical in that sense, in a positive sense, from the perspective of interfaith dialogue theory, who has basically immersed himself in these 3 religious traditions for a period of 10 years. But obviously, not all of us have the luxury, perhaps even the ability or willingness and capacity to do the same. But we can nonetheless do this to a lesser extent. Now, it is very important for us to understand that there are limits to this empathy. Of course, there are limits to empathy in general, but what I mean by that is that in order for us to empathize with the religious other, we do not necessarily have to empathize with all of the beliefs and practices that are specific to that religious tradition, but only some of them. Finally, the final condition, which is the self-sufficient condition, and that in many ways actually incorporates all of the other 4 conditions that I have talked about, namely humility, interconnectedness, empathy, and now I cannot think of the last one, commitment. So all of these, hospitality to truth actually entails or incorporates all of the 4 previous elements that I have just briefly talked about. So it's about really recognizing religious truth, if you like, in other religious traditions. And not only that, the ability to integrate that truth into one's own tradition. So, as I said, this is the sole sufficient condition for constructive dialogue, because it integrates and presupposes all of the other 4 that I've just talked about. Now, just like in the case of empathy, in order to embody and in order to be able to essentially exercise hospitality to truth, we do not necessarily need to embrace, so to speak, every religious element that is constitutive of the religious tradition of the other. But this recognition of truth in another religious tradition can be partial and does not necessarily need to be complete. Okay, so these are the 5 elements that, as I said, this is a very brief and very partial and incomplete explanation of the 5 conditions. I have just summarized them in order for the audience to get a basic understanding of what they are about. They need, of course, much more unpacking, and they have been elaborated on and described and discussed by Professor Catherine Cornell in much more depth and much more rigor. However, hopefully, what I have presented to you has given you a basic understanding of what these conditions are. And our intention is to, in the subsequent series, in subsequent episodes or series, delve deeply into each of these conditions, both from a theoretical perspective, but also from the perspective of the lived experiences of the speakers who are going to address each of these conditions separately, who themselves have a very long-standing and rich involvement in interfaith dialogue. Thank you for your attention, and I hand over now to the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore, Muhammad Imran. And a little bit more about Muhammad before I hand over to him. Muhammad Imran is the founder and the founding board member of the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore. He has more than 2 decades of experience in interfaith work. He was formerly associated and was working for the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. He also is an associate research fellow at the Studies in Interreligious Relations in Plural Societies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His commentaries on religion and multiculturalism have been published in various newspapers, such as the Straits Times, Channel News Asia, and South China Morning Post. He is currently the director of Buddhi, an intercultural consultancy in Singapore. Muhammad Imran, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Adis. As I was reflecting on the topic, who is my God, I'm also quite cognizant of the fact that I might be coming from a particular bias, being a Muslim and coming from the Abrahamic faith, and therefore this notion of God is something that comes from a bias of being from the Abrahamic faith. But certainly we are talking about conception of divinity, which might be expressed and might manifest in different ways. So the title, Who is My God, is very interesting. And of course, behind me is this city of 3 faiths, Toledo. Some of you probably might be very familiar with this in Spain. It's about an hour from Madrid. It's a city of 3 faiths. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and everyone claiming to know God within their respective tradition. But yet we find that throughout history, religious communities have fought with each other and have tried to make exclusive claims for the understanding of God. And that is why I think interfaith dialogue is very important, because everyone claims to know who God is, but nobody seems to understand much. And that is why talking together will reveal this vast glory of the divine in which we all aspire towards. Because I'm also quite concerned, particularly looking at the recent situation in neighboring country Malaysia, where some Muslims are claiming that the word Allah is only for the exclusive use of Muslims, and therefore people of other faiths are not allowed to even use the name Allah. And it got me thinking to how much sometimes we have objectified the divine. And in the words of a scholar from South Africa, he did mention about this tendency to colonize God. Like in a football match where you'll be asking God to help your team win on one side, but the other side will also be asking God to make their team win in the football match. So we tend to colonize God and bring God to our own side. Yeah. So of course that is very human, and that is something I hope interfaith dialogue, particularly amongst the Abrahamic faiths, can actually discuss in deeper details. Now, that is my first preamble. And secondly, we can see that actually theology is very diverse, even within a particular faith, right? We can't claim that Islam, for example, has only one form of theology, because theology manifests in many different ways. And that's why we have different schools of thought. We have different understanding even within a particular faith. So bearing in mind that each faith is not monolithic, also opens up a space for dialogue, not just across the faiths, but also internally within the faiths. And when we talk about who is God, sometimes it's much tougher to define it within our own respective traditions than across the traditions. So that is something that we need to bear in mind also as we move along in the various seminars. I'm particularly interested in the fact that sometimes our theology is being shaped by not just by reading of the sacred texts or something that has been bequeathed through tradition, but it interacts very much with the social and political conditions that shapes why one particular theology is dominant or being accepted within a faith community as compared to another form of theology which may remain marginalized or being an undercurrent within that particular faith. So understanding the social and political conditions pretty much part of the process of interfaith dialogues, because we need to understand why a particular way of approaching religion becomes dominant and why another way of approaching religion is not. And that has not so much to do with the theology, because theology is very diverse and may manifest in different ways, but that's got to do with the social and political conditions that shape a particular way of understanding religion. Which also brings to another aspect which is very important to be examined in interfaith dialogues, is the psychological conditions amongst the interlocutors. Yeah, what is the kind of psychological conditions that make someone willing to even engage in interfaith dialogue as compared to someone who has an aversion towards interfaith dialogue? What is the thinking process and the emotional reactions to the idea of interfaith dialogue itself? So that also needs to be interrogated and to be understood, because the end result of interfaith dialogue, of an effective interfaith dialogue, is always internal transformation. An interfaith dialogue that is effective will produce internal transformation either within the self, in which our ideas get expanded and we understand from a fresh perspective, or we understand a little bit deeper about the object that we are dialoguing about. It could also lead to internal transformation in our own religiosity too. In the words of Paul Nitter, for example, how do we be religious interreligiously? How does the other affect us and touches our lives and transform us in the way we understood the ultimate reality, in the way we live our lives, being touched by the fact that the other is no longer a stranger, but a part of us, as one community, where we are interdependent, where our existence can never be complete and rich and full without the acknowledging and embracing the other as co-pilgrims in our lives on earth. Now, the internal transformation is not just the self, but the tradition itself will be transformed through interfaith dialogues. And that's what we saw throughout history, where different faith communities, their traditions were transformed the moment they encounter another faith, another religion or another faith communities, and absorbing some of the ideas and the best of the other and formulating it in new ways of understanding. And that has actually expanded and enriched the religious communities, particularly in terms of the different religious civilizations that has developed through interactions with each other. Of course, the interactions have been marred by conflicts and violence in some cases, but in a large part, the interreligious encounters have actually contributed a lot to the development of human civilization as a whole. We can never imagine modern civilization without the contributions of the different religious civilizations that have interacted with each other and transform itself in ways that has actually defined who we are as one human civilization. So that, I think, is one aspect of another aspect of interfaith dialogue that need to be highlighted. And here, since we are discussing also Catherine Cornill's work, I would like to cite from her book, which is called The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, where she said, interreligious dialogue is, simply put, a challenge for most religious traditions. Now, this is very interesting because she put interreligious dialogue as a challenge for most religious traditions. Scholars engaged in the dialogue between religions have proposed varying lists of conditions for fruitful dialogue. Some focus on necessary social and political conditions, for example, freedom of religion, separation of state, church and state, whereas others emphasize essential psychological attitudes and dispositions necessary for genuine conversation and exchange. While such external circumstances are indeed necessary, it seems to me that the main obstacle for dialogue lies not so much outside as within religious traditions. As such, I wish to focus here on the conditions for dialogue as they pertain to the very self-understanding of religious traditions. Now, this is essentially what I have mentioned earlier, where interfaith dialogue is supposed to bring about internal transformation in our own ideas on religion, in our own practice of the religion, in light of the other, and our encounters with the other, as well as the transformation of the tradition itself. And here I would like to bring the 4 conditions. Of course, Catherine Cornill says 5 conditions, but here I would like to focus on 4 conditions which I came up with just before the talk, which I call the 4 I's. The 4 I's, yeah, nothing to do with my name Imran, which starts with the letter I, but this is the 4 I's that first begins with the I of the intention. And people who are engaging in interfaith dialogue needs to be very clear of their intent. It's about searching together for truth, for values that we hold together as humans, the idea of justice, the idea of compassion, mercy, etc., as well as the intention to search for a common understanding that can actually help us to navigate through this life together. The second I is inquisitiveness. I think it's a necessary condition for us to be curious towards things that we don't understand, towards things that we do not know. And that sense of curiosity pushes us towards engagement, towards searching for an answer, searching for a way of trying to understand, and that naturally brings us to a table where we can actually engage in interfaith dialogue because of that sense of inquisitiveness that actually is the very opposite of the sense of I know everything. Yeah, and if you think that you know everything, then there is no sense of curiosity anymore, because curiosity comes from this idea of an incomplete self, where there are certain domains of understanding and knowledge that we do not know, and therefore we want to search for answers, and that brings us into the way or into the path of engaging and asking and learning together with the other. Now, the third I is the interrogation. Of course, here I do not mean interrogation in the sense of a police interrogation. It's interrogation in the sense of a serious questioning of ourselves, first and foremost. I think people are afraid sometimes to interrogate themselves, to interrogate what they know or what they think they know, because they might come to a conclusion where the things that they know may not be really what it is, and therefore it kind of puts you in a kind of an imbalance, and therefore interrogating yourself becomes a very scary prospect. Even people are searching, especially in today's fast changing world, people are searching for certainty, and very few will be able to live with ambiguities, with the in-betweens, with the gray areas, with the idea that I do not know. And that itself is a very interesting question to ask and to acknowledge and to admit, actually. Can we live with doubts about our own understanding? Now, if you do not come from this perspective and you come to a table in a dialogue and say, I know everything and my knowledge is absolute, there's no learning, there's no reason why to even engage in interfaith dialogue. And it becomes then just preaching about what I already know to others, or even it could be a platform for proselytizing. I think that is not what interfaith dialogue is all about. So interrogating ourselves and looking at ourselves in the mirror and really asking the deepest questions about ourselves is part and parcel of the conditions needed for an effective interfaith dialogue. And of course, interrogation means that we are also allowed to ask about the others. Sometimes people are just too afraid to ask about the others, but that also then means that you do not allow that process of clarification to come and to educate and to make you understand. So it is important in interfaith dialogue for us to be able to interrogate each other, but of course in a way that is actually sincere and asking for truths or asking for an understanding towards a particular object of discussion. Yeah, it's not interrogation in the sense of trying to debate and trying to win an argument or to make another person look bad or put down another tradition. I don't mean in that sense, but to interrogate together on our deepest beliefs and our deepest way of looking at the world, and in order to come to a more richer and deeper understanding of the issue. And the last I is, I would say, is inclusiveness. I think interfaith dialogue sometimes happens amongst people who already share a certain outlook, and it becomes a platform of simply affirming each other. And I mean, that might be in some cases could be good in the sense that we come together as like-minded individuals who are out to understand each other. But inclusiveness also includes constantly being challenged, which means that getting groups or even individuals that we are not familiar with, getting them to the table and trying to listen with empathy, and therefore being exposing ourselves to the unfamiliar, which puts us also in this sense of vulnerable position where our own ignorance will be exposed. But that is part and parcel of the learning process for an effective interfaith dialogue. Constantly asking, therefore, who is not at the table is very important, because we have to be constantly made aware that our sense of understanding will not be complete until we give everyone a chance to share their perspectives, and we ourselves open to listening and trying to make sense of it from groups that we are unfamiliar with. Of course, being at the table is not just, it doesn't end there, but to ensure that in that process of dialogue, we view each other as equals. I don't think an interfaith dialogue can ever be effective once you have a situation where one group thinks that they are more superior than the other. That is precisely anti-dialogue. And I think many scholars of interfaith dialogue have highlighted that the conditions of seeing each other as equals at the table in discussing a particular matter is part and parcel of the golden rule of interfaith dialogue that we must adhere to in order to make it as effective as possible, in order for us to learn from each other. Because if you think of yourself as superior than the other, then it's a situation of domination, and therefore it will make it difficult for us to even open ourselves to listen to the others, and the other also will feel themselves not being appreciated enough in order to share their understanding and for mutual learning to take place. Now, the other aspect that I was asked to describe is, of course, the situation here in Singapore. Yes, you know, probably you probably know that in 2014, Pew Research Center has described Singapore as the most religiously diverse nations in the world. I know a lot of countries will disagree with this, but this is based on their methodology. And certainly we have many minority religious groups in Singapore, as much as the categories of world religions here in Singapore. But nonetheless, since independence in 1965, well, we are fortunate here that we have not experienced major conflicts or racial or religious strife. And this has probably got to do with the calibration and management of the racial and religious identity in Singapore. In fact, the pursuit of religious harmony has been made a key aspect of governance since the founding of the nation. And as Guat had mentioned earlier, close to 80% of the population profess to belong to a faith tradition. Even though Singapore, just like Australia, is a secular state. So the principle of secularism, in the sense of the state being neutral towards the religious groups, is a standing principle, and the state inoculates itself from the influence of religious communities, and at the same time managing and at sometimes directly intervening into religious communities in various ways through legislations, policies, and partnerships with religious institutions and community leadership. The activist nature of the state, I would say, in managing interreligious relations is not born out of some philosophical argument on the value of religion in society. Rather, the reason is much more pragmatic. Singapore is being a small nation state without natural resources, and the hinterland has to rely heavily on human resource. And given the deep diversity within Singapore society, Singapore has no choice but to pursue a nation building project that aims to harmonize the people towards a more effective workforce and preventing divisions that can threaten the survival of the nation. So very pragmatic reasons why the state is very much involved in forging inter-religious harmony here in Singapore. Now, race and religion has been a major source of difference in terms of identity, and this can be seen as part of the security landscape to be managed very carefully where possible. And any form of tensions that can be a problem in the future is nipped in the bud, as how the government government leaders will say it. And Guat has mentioned the trauma of the racial and religious riots in the years leading up to the independence of Singapore in 1965, and including the volatile situation surrounding the region in our neighboring countries, especially with the rise of ethno-nationalism and religious-based conflicts, has contributed to the whole security outlook that informs how religious communities in Singapore are being managed. And the result is probably for many people from other parts of the world, they might be very appreciative of the fact that in Singapore, you don't have an open conflict involving religion. And the relative peace and stability, or harmony as many in Singapore would call it, cannot be underplayed. But I've written a paper together with Professor Paul Hedges, and we argued that the situation in Singapore is probably much more complicated than how you probably would just read from a superficial understanding of it. And we explain, we call this situation as precarious toleration. And let me explain a bit on how we get to this situation, because it's a combination of unique circumstances here in Singapore, as well as our exposure to the global context, which maybe our friends in Australia can also relate to. Firstly, any attempt to understand religion in Singapore must take into consideration how closely religion is related to ethnicity here in Singapore. Guat has mentioned about the racial makeup of Singapore, and most Chinese belongs to what we would call the Chinese religions, comprising of Buddhism, Taoism, and a mix of folk Chinese beliefs and practices. And almost all Muslims are Malays, and I'm a Muslim from Malay ethnicity. Majority of the Indians are Hindus, although there are also Indian Muslims and Indian Christians. Of the major religions, only Christianity is perhaps less identified with ethnic category, although majority of Christians are Chinese with a significant adherence amongst the Indians. So given the issues of ethno-nationalism and racial politics in the region, the interplay between race and ethnicity and religion complicates the pursuit of inter-religious harmony here in Singapore. I hope to hear more about the situation in Australia maybe later on. Now, the second aspect that needs to be understood is the period of the 1970s. 1970s saw the rise of religious activism across the major faith traditions. This is a period known as religious revivalism, where Christianity grew significantly over 2 decades, with churches turning towards Pentecostalism with a strong drive for evangelism. And the connection to American charismatic movements cannot be ignored. Similarly, the Muslim community saw similar fervors of proselytization, or what is known as da'wah. And globally, there was a rise of Muslim consciousness, and Singapore's closest neighbor, Malaysia, began from 1982 onwards, a state-led project of Islamization. Buddhism too saw a revival amongst the English educated, connecting temples and devotees to neo-modernist Buddhist movements in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the West. And the rise of Hindu nationalism in India had also impacted the local Hindu communities here. Now, all this led to tensions emerging and moving in 2 directions. One is the increasing power and influence of the religious groups, which can at times encroach into what the state perceives as the purview of politics and not religion. And 2, the aggressive forms of proselytization coupled with an increasing exclusivist ban of religion cause consternation between 2 or more religious groups when they compete for souls, when they try to win souls for heaven, so to speak. This was the context for the introduction of a significant legislation here in Singapore, and it'll be interesting for our Australian counterparts, is what we call the law. The law is called the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, which was introduced in 1990. The impact of this legislation is deep and lasting. It effectively kept religious groups at bay, often pushed within the confines of their own temples, churches, or communities, while the state began to engage in a project of expanding the common space, which is often touted as the secular space. Now, of course, this coincided with the end of the Cold War and the ushering of economic liberalization, and therefore to attract new investments and talent in a knowledge-based economy from the 1990s onward, the public space must be vibrant. And we saw from then on in Singapore, new groups that were previously excluded in the playground of the religious revivalists, they began to make public appearance. And coming together of the atheists as well as the LGBTs, and capitalizing on the opening of spaces in a more relaxed political environment, especially after the era of Lee Kuan Yew, which many saw him as an iron will guy managing Singapore. This sets the stage for later tensions, which currently we are grappling with. And of course, the emergence of social media also has become the main catalyst for the implosion of some of the I wouldn't call it conflict, but tensions in late Singapore society. Now, there is a third factor that must be mentioned here, September 11 and the so-called global war on terror. The discovery of the Jemaah Islamiyah terrorist cell here in Singapore and the region as well has raised alarm. It seems that keeping religious communities apart for the sake of keeping peace will no longer work. When groups are out, when they are out of the public sphere, it is more difficult to monitor them. It is at the same time, when groups are outside the eyes of public scrutiny, prejudices may fester, which in the period of the tension where terrorists are out to exploit the divisions in society, groups may actually act upon their prejudices. This sets a context for the major shift in policy, giving rise to national interministerial agenda for social cohesion, which in Singapore we called it the Community Engagement Program, which was introduced in 2006. So there has been many initiatives to promote interfaith dialogue and social cohesion work, and we saw, for example, the emergence from 2006 onward, institutions like the Harmony Center, which is an interfaith institution where I used to work with, under the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, as well as onepeople.sg. It came in the post-2006 era onward. This was a period of the mushrooming of interfaith work. Now, dialogues now in Singapore are seen as important. Bringing the religious communities into conversation is no longer seen as a cause of conflict. Now, before that, prior to 1990, for example, in the 1980s, bringing religions together will be a source of conflict. But in a post-September 11 world, it is a necessary aspect of social cohesion to bring the communities together and engage in interfaith dialogue. But at the same time, with the more acute situation with the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State terrorist organization, the evolution of global terrorism in general has also changed the context a little bit, and religion has came back to be seen as a potential source of conflict, with new tensions also emerging between conservative religious groups and the now better organized movements such as the LGBTs. The call for separation became stronger, and tolerance became the default rather than understanding. So this is the new situation where we have new tension emerging, and people are calling for separation instead, and tolerance rather than to engage directly. So it's returning back. The flurry of petitions and police reports over disagreements and what are perceived as offensive to one group or another puts a halt to the initial optimism that dialogue is the way forward. But I will argue that dialogue is still the way forward. Yet it must seriously confront with what is missing in the dialogue process, rather than saying that dialogue leads to nowhere, because there is some skepticism within society about interfaith dialogue. Because we are just discussing where is it going, it's just talk shop, it's not really making any changes, and therefore there's some level of skepticism towards interfaith dialogue. But I will argue that dialogue is an important element still, and we need to continuously push for it. Firstly, interfaith dialogue, but to do that, I think interfaith dialogue needs to transform itself also. And firstly, interfaith dialogue must start engaging in real issues in society that people are grappling with. Interfaith dialogues observably are still shying away, at least in Singapore, from discussing hot button issues for various reasons. One main reason is there seems to be a lack of interlocutors who can actually model how a civil conversation over deep differences should look like. This lacking of skills is telling of the decades of keeping the religious communities apart in order to achieve the state of tolerance, which is precarious, as how Paul and I argued in our paper. Now, the second reason is fear. This fear is actually real, given the ingrained idea that bringing up differences openly will cause disagreements, and disagreements can lead to conflict, and conflict will lead to riots and eventually destroy Singapore. It's a whole list of slippery slope argument from one to another, and therefore this fear is real, and people tend to not want to engage in the discussion over differences. Now, secondly, interfaith dialogue tends to be helmed by groups and institutions who have a stake in portraying themselves as the sole representatives of the religion or the religious community. I like what Ari had mentioned earlier, that dialogue can only happen between individuals, not so much of institutions. Institutions can't speak except through the people who are in that institution. So it's a dialogue amongst individuals who come from faith backgrounds and from an authentic position where they speak not on behalf of the entire community, because the community is necessarily diverse, right? How can I speak on behalf of Islam when Islam comprises of billions of Muslims and comprised of people with different views on various issues and have many schools of thoughts? You have the Sunnis and the Shias. Even the Sunnis, you're divided over various schools of thought, etc. And even each individual position on a particular issue in religion might differ from another person, even from within the same school of thought. So it's best to speak on behalf of ourselves as not as sole representatives of religion, but as interlocutors of dialogue where we come from our own personal stand. So that becomes very important in how interfaith dialogue needs to transform. Now, if you were to be exposed to the theories of interfaith dialogue, the idea of interfaith dialogue cannot be divorced also from the need for intrafaith dialogue at the same time. And that has been mentioned earlier also by Dr. Adis. This, however, is a component that is sorely missing and can pose a problem in the future, if not already seen within minority groups who have been excluded and are demanding their space at the same table as how I've mentioned. So interfaith dialogue has to transform itself and become more and more inclusive. Now, third, interfaith dialogue must also involve a group that is increasing in numbers in Singapore. And I'm referring here to the the non, which means that those without any religious affiliation. It's interesting to observe that a community organization here, onepeople.sg, had organized a community leaders conference in 2018 with the theme of building what is called interbelief relations. Now, this is a new term that is circulating. It's not just interfaith, but interbelief also, because not believing in God is also part of belief. And therefore, we have to be inclusive and include them in the conversations too. And of course, here in Singapore, the Humanist Society of Singapore have been participating also in many interfaith dialogues. Although religious institutions tend to be more guarded in giving atheists or people with no religious affiliations a platform for in interfaith dialogues, because of the presumption that the good comes from religion, and therefore people with no religion will have nothing significant to say about the idea of the good or on moral principles, which is a stereotype that needs to be unpacked and needs to be debunked once we engage with people who belong to this category. And that has to occur sooner than later. I would say that even though there is greater awareness on the importance and need for interfaith dialogue in Singapore, the process of dialoguing itself remains underdeveloped and in its infancy due to two factors. One, we have not cultivated the art of dialogue over several decades, preferring instead to avoid. So there's a strong culture of avoidance here when it comes to differences that people observe or encounter. And secondly, we still have the fear that engaging in religious issues can potentially lead to conflict. So it makes us rather to keep quiet than having to deal with misunderstanding or even a police report over what others perceive as being offensive. Now, for the reasons above that I've mentioned, the state of interreligious relations here in Singapore remains precarious, and that has been my argument all along, but with a high degree of tolerance, although one aspect that needs to be developed further is the engagement with difference, which is the only way to cross into the territory of interreligious understanding and hopefully of embracing and celebrating the diversity more than seeing diversity as a potential source of conflict to be managed bureaucratically or in dry, pragmatic sense. So I think this is where hopefully SIFU, by SIFU I mean the Center for Interfaith Understanding, can move in its direction and contribute to a better transformation of interfaith dialogue as a whole, both for Singapore and also for others who are interested in this kind of work. And thank you, Dr. Adis, for initiating this program. And hopefully the conversations that we're going to have in subsequent seminars is going to also be learning points for us here in Singapore. And of course, I would like to hear also later on your description of the situation in Australia. Thank you.
Imran, there was a fascinating account of not only the Singaporean context, but also some excellent insights of theoretical nature. The 4 I's, I'm going to steal them from you. That was really very thorough, comprehensive, informative. I think all of us have learned a lot from you, and we can see that you've come into this from a wealth of knowledge, with enthusiasm and decades-long commitment, and contemplating on these issues deeply. So thank you very, very much for sharing your excellent probing insights. In the remaining time, we would like to invite our audience to also participate actively in our discussions, and I open the floor to any questions. I believe we are live on Facebook. There could be some questions there. Imran, if you don't mind facilitating that aspect of the event. So yeah, and Gaurav, if you don't mind.
Yes, we'll do that. I have some questions while we're waiting for other questions. Okay, my question has been, what has been the experience in Australia regarding the interreligious dialogue, regarding the use of possibly Catherine Cornell's principles? I offer it to Ari or Adis to give.
I believe Ari has a much better, more insights, because I have been traveling overseas and I'm not really familiar with the Australian scene as much, but I'm happy to speak a little bit. But Ari, please.
The interfaith dialogue that we mainly are doing is not based on the Cornell model. It's mainly trying to get people in the same room to be able to talk to each other and realize the similarities and the differences they have, and acceptance. So in Toowoomba, we have an international multi-faith conference once a year. This year it was national due to COVID-19 travel restrictions, but all the events that we have, or we had in Brisbane before the centre closed, were designed to share experience, share beliefs, and familiarize ourselves with the other. Over to you, Adis.
Thank you, Ari. What has been the most difficult or challenging or challenges that you've had in dealing or organizing conversations with people of different faiths? Are there specific examples of difficulties and difficulties in including people at the table, or difficulties in people not wishing to attend? Because I find that Catherine Cornell's requirements, all right, of who attends and who is the one who's going to be speaking, a lot of people would actually shy away because they said they are not equipped enough to speak on the behalf of their religion. And in her viewpoint, you're not speaking, you're not representing yourself, you're representing the religion. Can I have some of your comments?
I'm assuming that was directed at me. What? Yes. Yeah, these conditions actually can be rather daunting. Yeah. And it is perhaps only the select few that might consider themselves as really fulfilling all of these conditions. But I think the theoretical framework is there not so much to discourage people and to be kind of elitist and say that unless you check these boxes, you can't take part. It's more about to encourage those people who are already engaging and they are already practitioners of interfaith dialogue to introspect, to contemplate in terms of their experiences, in terms of also finding ways in which they can orient themselves and in terms of kind of attitudes that they could adopt or should adopt in order to gain the most out of it. So it kind of it's I guess it's applied retrospectively rather than prospectively. In relation to the difficulties, yeah, my own personal experience tells me that there are a number of reasons as to why people might be not predisposed favorably. These could be pragmatic, just having too many things to do. It's not a priority. They do not see the importance of interfaith dialogue, perhaps the way we do. Clearly, some people perhaps have not even thought about it, given the competing considerations that exist in all of our lives. So attendance, especially regular attendance, has always been an issue, not just in organizing events as part of my role as one of the people who is associated with the Network of Spiritual Progressives, but I have also co-founded something called an Abrahamic Alliance when I was living in Perth, and we back in the early 2000s, and we've had similar issues. So that is really a very, very important problem that needs to be addressed. How to popularize, how to make interfaith dialogue more attractive, more appealing, how to make it an imperative, if you like, how to broaden the circle of people who would find it meaningful and interesting and worthwhile. I do not have any I do not have any solutions to offer, unfortunately. Perhaps apart from just saying that we keep trying, we keep on highlighting the importance and the benefits, living in hope, and hoping that some of our own enthusiasm will emanate and hopefully will bring into fold more people.
I think we all have similar issues about popularizing it, the interfaith dialogue, and making it more appealing and broadening the critical group. All right. Perhaps would any of you like to add or to comment about some ideas or programs that could be used? Imran? No? Ari?
I found that getting people in the same room is the major step. And one of the biggest problems that I have discovered is the press. The press's portrayal of different faith traditions for different reasons tends to give people a false impression on what these people believe, what these people do, who these people are. And it's getting over that preconceived idea of what the other is, that once that's done, people can relax and actually enjoy what they're doing. We were the first state in Australia to have a forum of Christian, Jews, and Muslims. And when I took over as the Jewish chair, we would meet once a month, and we were an agenda-based group. And the group that was chairing the meeting had to provide the food. So very quickly, after about 4 months, we became a menu-based group where we didn't have an agenda anymore, because we all got together and we sat down, we literally sat down, ate food. We had a brilliant lady Yayela, who was our support person, and she would sit there as joining in, and she would come up with a set of minutes about what we discussed. And we thought that was just absolutely brilliant. But what we did is we established true relations, true friendships, and we were able to talk about more contentious issues as friends rather than as religious enemies or entities. So it was a case of turning up somewhere. I would turn up with my friend Sultan and someone else, and it was just us arriving. But to other people, there was this Muslim, this Jewish, and a Christian guy walked into a bar. You know, it sounds like the start of a joke. What are we going to do? But that's it. It should reach the stage where that's just normal. So we all the events that I try to do are very much involved in social and food.
Can I just add that in Singapore, I think after 9/11, a lot of the hawker centers or food courts actually offered halal food. Previously, not so abundant. And the Chinese, the Malay, the Indians, and everybody, we could all sit together at a table and we could eat all kinds of food, whether it's Chinese food, whether it's Indian food, whether it's Western food. And I think it gave a moment of us for conversation, for just getting to know each other, have soup and comment about the food. And as you said, sometimes food may be the first icebreaker. Okay, any comments? Because I want to read something from the audience. And they said,
just a very quick one. At our International Interfaith Conference, I think 2 or 3 years ago, a gentleman from Singapore came along, and he was a mediator, and he would mediate different disputes and whatever. And he said that what he did was, if it was 2 families, he got the 2 families together, took them to a restaurant, sat them around a table, didn't talk about anything, ordered food. And he said by the time everyone finished food, whatever problem it was very easy to fix up, because then both parties wanted to sort it out because they recognized themselves in the other. So I think it's people sitting down, sharing food builds bridges, huge bridges.
Yes, it does. Okay,
sorry, God, can I add on?
Sorry,
yeah, I absolutely love the conversation over food. I just want to share that it's important also to check some of our blind spots. And I had this awakening because, being minority Muslim here in Singapore, sometimes you attend events and people forget to cater for halal food. But of course, those who have been more sensitized to the diverse dietary needs of the different groups here in Singapore, then they would cater for halal food. And I'll be very happy when, okay, there's a halal food. But sometimes when I see the halal food, I don't see much vegetarian food. And I was thinking, what about some of my friends who are vegetarian, and out of the 10 options, yes, I'm happy that it's halal food. I can eat the 10 dishes on the table, but the ones that are vegetarian or even vegan is just 3 dishes out of 7, and that's not very fair to the vegetarians also, as much as I feel that is being fair to me. So we must always have at the back of our mind, what are our blind spots? And sometimes, as much as we would like things to be catered to us, we must also think of groups that disadvantage also, even other minority groups that may also not subscribe to the same dietary laws or needs. And I had this moment where I was told that some Sikhs don't actually consume halal food or halal meat because they can't partake meat that is being slaughtered in the name of another god. And then I was thinking, okay, I've never thought about the Sikhs amongst us who probably would not take halal food. So that's another layer. So it's constantly trying to be as inclusive as possible requires us to actually learn across the different diverse communities. And that's an exciting process, but at the same time, it also makes you sometimes make a lot of mistakes along the way because you don't understand things, but it's a moment to be educated also. And that's how we actually grow together to understand the deep diversity amongst us. So it's a learning process always.
That's why in my events, I always try for vegetarian, no cheese. It offends the least number of people.
Okay, so let me read a comment from the audience. I find the idea of embracing difference interesting, but somewhat trite. Furthermore, I suspect for many, the challenge is for a sincere embrace as they struggle to remain authentic to their traditions. Any comments?
Well, I think most of us, if you don't mind, I jumped in. Most of us can relate to this statement. Yeah. I guess one way that we could deal with this is by recognizing that difference is present both at the level of the individual, who I was yesterday, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, could be potentially quite different to what I am right now, but also, and this Imran has talked about this idea that our own religious traditions themselves are very diverse, and that the concept of a religious tradition is a dynamic concept. So, and in many ways, by clinging to a non-dynamic understanding of oneself and the religious tradition, we could actually be betraying both ourselves and our tradition. So if we embrace a more dynamic view of ourselves and how we differ from on a day-to-day or whatever time frame we want to use, as well as by recognizing, by historicizing our own religious traditions, by recognizing their multiplicity, by recognizing that they are a living organism, not a dead fossil, then we would be more comfortable with this idea of embracing difference.
Yeah, I agree with Adis, because we have to understand that tradition itself evolves, and there is what we call tradition, or what we understand by tradition, is a dynamic process, as how Adis had mentioned. I think it's not a problem with the tradition if we understand tradition as evolving, but it's got to do with our own sense of familiarity, which we often cling on to in the midst of something that is different and therefore challenging to what we are familiar with. Our ability to deal with things that we are not familiar with. And again, I'll use the example of food. Yeah, okay, I'll use something that will not be offensive to the most number of people. I'll talk about my own family. in a sense that, you know, when I bring my parents to holiday, for example, I brought them to Australia once, and my mom, she will always look for Malay food, even in Australia, yeah, because that's what she's familiar with, and she's looking for Malay food. That means it's staple rice, and you know, Malay food, you know, at least in Australia, is very expensive. It's run by Malaysian restaurants and all that, right? It's something that is seen as exotic, you know. Similarly, you know, when I've noticed friends who go to other parts of the world, they go to Europe and they're looking for, again, something they're familiar with. So it's just part of our human tendency to always look for something that is familiar and we feel secure. Because there's something, it's part of our habit, and part of the way we respond to things that we are not familiar with is to retract and to be back into our safe zones. This is different from some other people or some other individuals who are a bit more adventurous like me. If I go to a different country, I would want to try the cuisine of that country. Why would I go back and find Malay food? Because I can go back home and I can eat Malay food as much as I like, but I would like to try something different. So it's got to do with human personalities also. The real issue is, how do we make it safe enough for someone not to fear difference and to be a bit more willing to open themselves up to try to pick a little bit into things they are not familiar with, and hopefully in that process lead them to a different perspective or even understanding. How do we create the conditions necessary for difference not to be something to be feared, but something to be embraced in the sense of being challenged, but at the same time that challenge doesn't mean that they are losing their authenticity. You can be authentic and still embrace difference, and that has got to do with how you view the tradition. In fact, I've mentioned earlier, the traditions are very diverse even internally, and there are plenty of resources within our own religious I mean, there are plenty of religious sources in our own traditions that can support with the need to learn and embrace the difference and incorporate some of it even into our outlook. But there's also the other part where there are also the tradition, another part of the tradition which wants to keep purity and exclude everything else because they are not seen as contaminating the authenticity of the religion. So it's the social political conditions that actually make one perspective more appealing than the other. In a situation where the socio-political context induces fear and the sense of siege from the external, the tendency is for us to retreat and say we want to maintain whatever purity or authenticity that we have, because the outside is seen as corrupting. But in a situation where we are confident of our own tradition, we are willing to explore. You look throughout Islamic history, the Muslims were able to incorporate learning from many different civilizations in the 9th and 10th century in Baghdad, for example, because they are confident of themselves. And therefore, they are able to translate Greek work, Indian work, and incorporate many of these within their own tradition, and it has evolved. But probably, you know, in the current context where Muslims are still grappling in a post-colonial condition, they are actually living still in a situation of being colonized, if not physically, but mentally also. And you see underdevelopment across Muslim societies, that sense of confidence is not there. And therefore, it's seen as whatever that we have is something to be protected, to be kept pure, and therefore to see themselves in the light of the other who is out to harm them, and this sense of under siege. So it really depends on the socio-political context of which perspectives actually eventually dominate in society.
Right, thank you, Imran. I have a question which is actually normally asked by people. In what way or how can dialogue turn into action? A lot of the time people complain that we're just talking. And can I have your views? We're talking and we're getting nowhere. Is that true?
Yes and no, a traditional Jewish answer. I believe that a lot of times people are just talking, but with the COVID-19 situation that we've had here in Australia, different interfaith groups are working together to support students, to support people in need, going around doing stuff. So it's not unusual to find a non-Sikh person helping the Sikhs deliver food to students, people from different faith traditions working together to achieve a social welfare goal, to demonstrate that it can be done. But it's a case of people need to be organized and willing to do it. Some people, I do believe, are just in it for the chat fest and the food, but I do believe that a lot of people agree they have to do things. We have to build things. We have to assist each other. Turning up at different houses of worship when things go wrong. Sympathizing with our brothers and sisters in the different faith traditions and supporting them through disasters, saying to them, you are not alone. We've just had the anniversary for the mosque massacre in New Zealand. And it's a case of no one stands alone these days. We are all affected by it. And I think to me, that is part of doing something to show that we are actually together. And being seen, I did programs with different faith traditions. And at one particular time, I used to meet with a professor from Griffith University who was a sheikh as well, and from the Griffith Islamic Research Unit. And we used to go and sit in a coffee shop, because just two of us, a Jew and a Muslim, sitting in a coffee shop together having coffee, people just never knew whether we were going to blow up the place or blow up each other. And then we'd stand up, give each other a big hug and say, love you, brother, we'll see you next time. Again, we organised the Abrahamics Forum at Parliament House here in Brisbane. It was a Christian, Jews and Muslims, different groups got together and we organised it. And it was very interesting to see the change in the dynamic of everyone as we got to know each other. And those people that was back in 2006, I think, and those people are still friends of mine. And we still call upon each other at different times. You know, we need someone, come and do it, come and do it. So a lot of times it's a bit symbolic, but a lot of times, like with the Toowoomba Interfaith Working Group, we organise conferences, we organise events, we turn up at things, Australia Day, we sent a contingent along to be seen. And that shows that people of different faiths can get on. And that just starts people thinking. And I think that's the important thing. And plus there was free food. So we obviously went.
Thank you, Ari.
If I could just briefly share my perspective. I think I do value, and I see a lot of value in action. But I think we should not underestimate the importance of interrogating, to use Imran's word, interrogate, like cognitive action, if you like, interrogating our assumptions, changing our conceptual vistas and theologies. I think changing our theologies is extremely important, especially, of course, within the interfaith dialogue context. Action, of course, has its place, but I see that a wrong type of theology can do a lot of damage. And modifying our theologies, you know, I think should be the primary objective of interfaith dialogue. Yeah, I'll leave it at that because we are running out of time.
All right. So can I just say something very encouraging? My background is actually evangelical. And many years before, I would have had to share the gospel with all of you, and so that you all would have to be saved. But it's because I spent some time in the Holy Land and I met a Jewish interfaith educator, Yehezkel Landau. And this was the first time I met a Jewish interfaith educator in the Holy Land. And I began to see different sides of the problem and the issue, and began to, how would we say, have empathy for all the sides of the people who are actually suffering. And I think that the work that you all do, even if you can inspire that one person or two, and if that one person has influence, that would change a lot in this world. So as my gift before, I'm going to hand it over to Adi. I'm going to give you a poem that I wrote, okay? When a square meets a circle. I came across a circle, so beautiful it was, all colors and stripes in harmonious song. The circle keeps its nature, belonging to its own, and closed in its tightness, in a beauty of its own. The square can't enter the circle, no matter how it tries. It listens to their song, but cannot sing along. There is warmth and love in the circle, but the square can only see it afar. The welcome is spoken, yet the square remains alone. How can a square enter the circle? How can it breach the impenetrable wall? It sits outside the circle, alone, rejected, forlorn. Only what lies in the circle can bring the square in. Only if the circle can see and unchain what locks it in. It lies within the links to open up its gate. Only the circle can bring the square in. All of us belong to circles which make harmonious song. In each circle lies its own beauty, in each lies its song. But when squares come upon us, they look like they don't belong. Yet each square was created to be part of the song. I hand the mic back to Ari.
Sorry, Guat, just one question. Where is the triangle? Sorry.
To coming.
Coming
Okay.
here? Okay.
Ari?
All right. I believe that since I have opened the proceedings, I shall close them. I must say I have thoroughly enjoyed our session. I have learned a lot from all of you, and I hope our audience has found our discussions of interest, and hopefully we have awakened their appetite for more. This was, as I mentioned at the very start, just the introductory part of the series. We have 5, from my perspective, very exciting events to happen throughout this year. I believe the next event will happen sometime in May, and it will focus on the question of epistemological humility. We have some marvelous speakers lined up, both from academic and kind of lived experiences perspectives. They combine both. So I really hope that what is yet to come is going to inspire all of us just as much as it inspired me today. And I do hope that we will make the difference, even if it's very small, and that we will learn new things and connect with new people and share experiences that are of mutual benefit. So in light of that, I wish everyone good night or a brand new day, wherever, depending upon where you are. And we look forward to connecting with you sometime in May. Keep an eye out on our marketing.